I still remember the dusty smell of that old, abandoned house. It stood at the edge of town, half hidden behind gnarled trees, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. We dared each other to go inside, me and my best friend, Ben. Back then, we were inseparable, two kids who thought we'd stay that way forever. The house was cold, darker than I expected. Broken floorboards creaked beneath our feet, and something about it made us whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake up whatever was hiding in the shadows. But even though it was eerie, being there with Ben made it feel like we were invincible, like nothing could touch us. We were only kids, but we felt brave that day, braver than we really were. We climbed up the old staircase, holding our breaths at each step, until we found a small room at the top. It was almost empty except for a rotting chair and some dusty, faded toys that someone had left behind. I don't know why, but something about that room felt sacred, like it had secrets just for us. Standing there, Ben turned to me with that mischievous smile he always had and said, "Let's make a promise." I laughed, brushing it off. "What, like a pact or something?" He nodded, serious this time. "Yeah. No matter what happens, we'll protect each other. Forever." At that moment, I thought it was just another game, something we'd forget by the time we got home. But there was something in his eyes, something that made me take it seriously. So I nodded, and we both whispered it, right there in that dusty, empty room. Forever. That was the last summer we spent together. Ben moved away not long after, and we lost touch like kids do. But I never forgot that promise. The older I got, the more it lingered in the back of my mind, like a whisper from that old house, a whisper I couldn't shake. I was sifting through my emails late one night, mindlessly deleting spam, when I noticed an email with no subject line. Normally, I'd skip right past it, but something made me stop. The sender's address was just a string of random letters and numbers. It didn't look familiar, but I opened it anyway. The message was short, almost too simple. "Meet me at the house. You remember the place?" At first, I thought it was spam, a prank, or maybe someone messing with me. But then I saw the signature. 3 words that only Ben would know. Our childhood joke, a phrase that meant nothing to anyone else but had us howling with laughter when we were kids. Seeing it after all these years sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't thought about Ben in ages, not in any real way, but in that moment memories came flooding back. The dusty smell of that house, our whispered promise in the tiny, dark room, the feeling that we were somehow untouchable. And now, here he was calling me back to that place. I wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as coincidence. But the memory of that promise gnawed at me. Forever, we'd said, and even though I knew it was ridiculous, part of me felt I had to go, as if I'd be breaking some sacred bond if I didn't. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while, my mind racing. There was no telling what I would find there, if anything. But one thing was clear. I'd made a promise all those years ago, and something in me knew that I had to keep it. The house looked different now, almost as if it had been waiting for me to come back. The roof sagged in places, more windows were broken, and thick vines crawled up the walls like bony fingers clutching at the brick. Felt alive somehow. I'd expected the decay, but something about it unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. I stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in around me, and then I stepped forward, feeling the ground soften beneath my feet. The door groaned as I pushed it open, and a stale, earthy smell hit me, thicker and sharper than I remembered. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating. As I walked through the entrance, every step seemed to echo, the sounds bouncing off the walls in strange, distorted ways. The house felt like it was breathing, the walls creaking and shifting, as if something were moving just beneath the surface. Shadows lingered in every corner, stretching and twisting in ways that made me feel like I was being watched. The staircase we'd climbed as kids was still there, though it leaned slightly now, warped and uneven. I reached out, running my hand along the banister, and felt the splintered wood crumble beneath my fingers. But even with the fear creeping up my spine, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Part of me was rooted here, bound by that promise we'd made. I could almost hear Ben's voice in my head, urging me to stay, reminding me of the words we'd whispered in the attic all those years ago. I forced myself to go further in, ignoring the pounding of my heart. Each room seemed darker than the last, filled with strange noises that I couldn't quite place. Soft whispers, the occasional creak, a faint rustling as if something was moving just out of sight. I found myself standing in the same small room at the top of the stairs, the one where we'd made our promise. It looked just as empty, save for the decaying chair and a thick layer of dust that covered everything. The silence here was different, heavier, like the house was holding its breath. I waited there, glancing at my watch and then back at the door, hoping Ben would walk through, hoping this would turn out to be some strange, elaborate joke. But the longer I waited, the more I felt a pull to stay, as if the promise itself was alive in these walls, keeping me anchored, keeping me bound. I don't know what drove me to keep moving through that house. Maybe it was the memory of Ben, or maybe it was something else, something dark that felt like it was coiling around me, urging me deeper in. I wandered through rooms that I barely recognized, rooms that seemed twisted and stretched, as if the house itself had grown wild and angry in Ben's absence. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. In a small room at the end of the hall, half buried beneath fallen debris, was a wooden box. The wood was dark, polished, and covered in dust, but the moment I brushed it off, my breath caught in my throat. Ben's name was etched into the lid, carved deep and crooked, like it had been done by a shaky hand. I could feel my heart pounding as I reached for the box. It was locked, but old and fragile. I used a loose nail to pry it open, and when the lock finally snapped, the lid creaked as I lifted it, revealing what was inside. There were photographs, dozens of them, some so faded they were barely more than smudges. But as I flipped through them, I saw faces that looked disturbingly familiar. Ben's family members, gathered around him in strange settings. One photo showed him standing in the very room I was in now, his face blank, eyes hollow as his family stood behind him, hands on his shoulders, their faces twisted in ways that looked unnatural. Beneath the photos were pages torn from old books, scrawled with symbols and rituals that I couldn't understand, each page more sinister than the last. But what shook me most was the final item in the box. A small bundle of hair, bound with a piece of frayed string. I recognized it instantly as Ben's. I remembered him cutting his hair one summer, saying he wanted a new look, but now, seeing it here, in this box surrounded by all these relics, it felt like something much darker. I sank to the floor, my mind reeling as pieces started to click into place. Ben's family, they'd always been strange, secretive. There had been whispers around town, rumors that they were into things best left alone. I'd laughed it off as a kid, thinking it was all just small-town superstition. But now, holding this box, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something had taken him, something not entirely human. Suddenly, everything felt colder. It was like the house was closing in on me, the walls pressing closer, that breathing sensation growing heavier. I tried to steady myself, clutching the box as if it held answers. But all it did was raise more questions, questions I was too afraid to ask. I wasn't alone in that house. I could feel it now, a presence that seemed to be lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. And as I stared down at Ben's name, carved in that shaky script, I realized he might have never left. The moment I decided to leave, the entire house seemed to shift, like it knew I was trying to escape. The shadows deepened, twisting along the walls and stretching out across the floor as if they were reaching for me. I clutched the box tight, a cold sweat covering my skin as I made my way back down the stairs, feeling every step tremble beneath me. Halfway to the door, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely more than a breath, but enough to make my blood run cold. "You promised." I froze. The voice was familiar, achingly so, but distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away, or from beneath layers of water. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it might burst, and that's when I saw it. In the dim light, a figure stood at the end of the hall. It was taller now, leaner, but there was no mistaking those eyes. Ben. or something that looked like him, a shadowy, twisted version of the friend I'd known. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were hollow, dark, and endless, as if he was caught in some kind of limbo, half here, half somewhere else. "Ben?" I whispered, barely able to force the word from my mouth. The figure tilted its head, like it recognized me, and a small, sad smile flickered across its face. "You promised to protect me. Forever." My mind spun, replaying that moment from our childhood in the dusty attic, our whispered vow. It had seemed like a game then, a child's innocent promise. But as I looked at him now, I realized it had been anything but. The house seemed to pulse around us, the walls almost breathing as he took a step closer. I wanted to back away, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, bound by a loyalty I couldn't shake. "What would happen to you?" I managed, my voice breaking. He just stared at me, and his eyes filled with something, desperation, maybe, or an ache that seemed to go far deeper than anything human. "They took me," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "I thought I could escape, but there's no way out. Not for me." I felt a surge of horror, mingled with guilt. Somehow, I knew that by coming here, I'd crossed a line, reopened a door that should have stayed closed. But the promise still hung between us, an unbreakable bond forged in that attic room years ago. "You have to help me," he whispered. "You promised. You have to come with me. Stay with me. Forever." I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but I could feel the weight of the vow tightening around me, binding me to him, to this place. The shadows grew thicker, curling around my ankles, pulling me toward him as if they had a life of their own. And as I took one trembling step forward, I realized what he was asking. If I left, I'd be breaking our promise. But if I stayed, there would be no coming back. "Forever," he murmured, reaching out a hand, his fingers almost skeletal, cold as ice as they brushed against mine. And in that moment, I knew there was no escaping the promise we'd made. Not now, not ever. With a final breath, I stepped forward into the darkness, letting it consume me, bound to keep my word, even if it meant crossing into a place I could never return from.